On
December 7th, 1941, Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards.
1941,
Many of these were demolished beyond repair. Direct hits were scored on hangars, and these were badly shattered. Equipment and airplanes.
Japanese aircraft roared over Pearl Harbor and shattered the illusion of American invulnerability. Battleships burned, thousands were killed, and Tokyo believed it had bought the one thing it needed most: time. But Pearl Harbor did not weaken the United States. It activated it. Beneath the smoke and wreckage lay a reality Japan had fatally misunderstood. Modern wars are not won by surprise or courage, but by factories, fuel, and replacement speed. This story isn't about heroics or single battles. It's about math, industry, and the moment Japan chose a war it could never sustain. Subscribe to No Man's Land for unapologetic military history focused on power, economics, and consequences, not myths. By the summer of 1941, Japan was not preparing for conquest. It was trying to escape a deadline. 4 years of war in China had consumed enormous amounts of fuel, steel, and manpower without delivering a decisive victory. The conflict had become a slow bleed, and Japan's industrial base was not built for prolonged attrition. Unlike continental powers, Japan possessed almost no domestic oil reserves. Nearly everything that kept its Navy and Air Force operational came from overseas. Roughly 80% of Japan's oil was imported, much of it from the United States. That dependency became a weapon in July 1941, when Washington froze Japanese assets and imposed a full oil embargo after Japan occupied French Indochina. Britain and the Dutch followed immediately. Overnight, Japan's fuel lifeline was severed. Japanese naval planners ran the numbers. Existing stockpiles could sustain operations for roughly 18 months. After that, the Imperial Navy would become immobile. Battleships trapped in port, carriers unable to sail, aircraft grounded for lack of fuel. For a regime dominated by military leadership, this was not an economic problem. It was an existential one. Japan now faced two options, neither acceptable. Withdrawal from China would mean political collapse at home, public humiliation, and the likely fall of the military government. The alternative was to seize new sources of oil by force. The Dutch East Indies offered vast reserves, but reaching them meant crossing waters controlled by the United States. American forces in the Philippines sat astride Japan's southern supply routes. The U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor could strike Japanese shipping at will. Any move south would invite American intervention. From Tokyo's perspective, securing oil without neutralizing American naval power was impossible. The war was no longer about expansion or ideology. It had become a race against depletion. Japan's leadership did not believe it could win a long war against the United States. What they believed, what they hoped, was that they could shock America badly enough at the outset to make that long war never happen. Pearl Harbor would be the opening move in that gamble. Japan's war plan was built on delay, not dominance. Its architects understood that the United States could not be conquered, occupied, or destroyed outright. The objective was far narrower and far more dangerous. Buy time. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, was one of the few men in Tokyo who clearly understood the imbalance. He had lived in the United States, studied its culture, and observed its industry firsthand. Yamamoto warned political leaders that Japan could fight aggressively for 6 months, perhaps a year. But beyond that point, the outcome was unpredictable and likely disastrous. His warning was not philosophical, it was mathematical. Despite this, Japanese planners believed they had a narrow strategic window. If the U.S. Pacific Fleet could be crippled for 6 to 12 months, Japan could seize the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, the Philippines, and other key territories. With those resources secured, Japan would build a defensive perimeter stretching across the Pacific. Fortified islands, extended American supply lines, and a veteran Japanese navy would make any counterattack brutally expensive. The theory rested on historical precedent. In 1905, Japan had defeated Russia, a larger empire, not by occupation, but by inflicting unacceptable costs. Russian leaders chose negotiation over continued sacrifice. Japanese strategists believed the same logic would apply to the United States. What they misjudged was the nature of American commitment once attacked. They assumed public opinion would fracture under casualties and distance. They believed Americans lacked the will to fight a long, distant war in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor was designed to shock the United States into hesitation, not rage. This plan also assumed flawless execution. American naval power had to be neutralized quickly and decisively. Carriers, submarines, fuel depots, and repair facilities all had to be removed from the board. Any surviving American capability would shorten the window Japan depended on. The gamble was extreme, but from Tokyo's perspective, inaction meant certain defeat. War offered at least the possibility of survival. Peace offered none. Pearl Harbor was not a surprise attack born of arrogance. It was a calculated act of desperation, an attempt to bend time, stall inevitability, and force a settlement before industrial reality could assert itself. Whether that gamble was rational or suicidal would be decided not in the skies over Hawaii, but in the factories, shipyards, and training schools that would respond next. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japan executed one of the most tactically impressive naval strikes in history. In under 2 hours, Japanese aircraft devastated Battleship Row at Pearl Harbor. 8 American battleships were sunk or damaged. Hundreds of aircraft were destroyed on the ground. More than 2,400 Americans were killed. From a purely tactical standpoint, the attack worked. But wars are not won tactically. They are won strategically. And strategically, Pearl Harbor failed almost immediately. The most critical American assets were not battleships. They were aircraft carriers, fuel reserves, repair infrastructure, and submarines. All survived. The 3 U.S. fleet carriers assigned to the Pacific, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were not in harbor. Their absence alone ensured that American offensive capability would recover far faster than Japan anticipated. Even more damaging was what Japan chose not to target. Pearl Harbor stored millions of gallons of fuel in above-ground tanks. These tanks fueled the Pacific Fleet, powered future operations, and sustained the submarine force that would later strangle Japan's economy. They were untouched. Dry docks and repair facilities remained intact, allowing damaged ships to be raised, repaired, and returned to service. The submarine base, which would launch the most destructive commerce raiding campaign in history, remained fully operational. Japan destroyed ships, but left systems intact. Within months, most of the damaged battleships were repaired or returned to service in secondary roles. More importantly, Pearl Harbor transformed American public opinion overnight. Before the attack, the United States was deeply divided about entering the war. After it, division vanished. The attack was perceived not as a military setback, but as betrayal. Negotiation ceased to be politically possible. Japan had hoped to shock the United States into caution. Instead, it unified the country behind total war. Strategically, Pearl Harbor achieved the opposite of its intended effect. It accelerated American mobilization, removed political hesitation, and ensured that the conflict would be fought to unconditional conclusion. The United States was no longer choosing whether to fight. it was choosing how hard. Japan bought time, but far less than it needed. And the clock it was racing had just started moving faster. The decisive factor in the Pacific War was not courage, innovation, or battlefield skill. It was capacity. And by every measurable standard, Japan entered the war against an opponent it could not economically sustain combat against. In 1941, the United States was an industrial colossus waiting to be activated. Once mobilized, its productive output dwarfed that of every Axis power combined. Steel production alone reveals the imbalance. American mills were producing more than 10 times the steel Japan could generate annually. Steel was not merely material, it was time, replacement, and margin for error. Japan had none of these. Oil presented an even harsher reality. The United States was the world's largest oil producer, drawing fuel from domestic fields in quantities Japan could not replicate or interrupt. Japan, by contrast, had virtually no domestic supply. Even after seizing oil fields in Southeast Asia, Japan lacked the tankers to transport fuel home safely. Production meant nothing without delivery. Population amplified the disparity. America fielded nearly twice Japan's population, providing a larger workforce, larger training pool, and greater resilience to losses. More importantly, the American economy was structurally flexible. It could expand war production without fully cannibalizing civilian life. Japan could not. Aircraft production exposed the fatal asymmetry. American factories would produce hundreds of thousands of aircraft during the war. Japan would produce a fraction of that number. Worse still, Japanese industry struggled to modernize designs or maintain quality as resources dwindled. American aircraft improved every year. Japanese aircraft became progressively obsolete. Pearl Harbor did not weaken this machine, it unlocked it. Factories shifted to round-the-clock production. Shipyards expanded. Training pipelines accelerated. Losses became temporary inconveniences rather than strategic crises. Japan's strategy required the United States to quit. But quitting was impossible once the industrial system was engaged. Every ship sunk was replaced. Every aircraft lost was rebuilt. Every pilot killed was replaced by 3 more in training. This was the war Japan never planned to fight, and could never afford to continue. From the moment American production reached full momentum, the outcome was no longer contingent on battles. It was governed by arithmetic, and arithmetic was unforgiving. Once American industry reached full mobilization, the Pacific War stopped being a contest of maneuver and became a contest of replacement. Japan could still fight skillfully. It could still win individual engagements, but it could no longer recover from loss at the same rate as its enemy. That imbalance grew wider every month. The United States did not merely increase production, it industrialized war itself. Shipyards were reorganized around speed and standardization. Liberty ships were assembled using prefabricated sections, reducing construction time from months to weeks. By 1943, American yards were launching new cargo ships at a pace that exceeded Japanese sinkings. Losses no longer mattered if replacements arrived faster. Aircraft production followed the same logic. American factories treated planes as consumables. Designs emphasized ease of manufacture, repair, and pilot survivability. Training pipelines expanded alongside production, ensuring that aircraft losses did not cripple operational strength. Japan, by contrast, relied on increasingly complex designs that strained limited resources and skilled labor pools. Warship construction revealed the asymmetry even more clearly. The United States produced carriers, destroyers, and escorts in parallel, not sequence. While Japan struggled to complete a handful of major vessels, American yards worked on dozens simultaneously. Escort carriers, cheap, fast to build, and good enough, flooded the Pacific. Quantity became its own form of quality. This production advantage altered American strategy. Commanders could accept risk that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. Ships could be committed aggressively because their loss would not end campaigns. Aircraft could be expended in massed strikes without concern for depletion. War planning no longer revolved around preservation, it revolved around pressure. Japan's leadership still believed in decisive battles, but decisive battles require the ability to absorb failure. Japan lacked that margin. Each lost ship represented months of irreplaceable labor. Each lost pilot represented years of training that could not be replicated. By 1943, the war's trajectory was no longer defined by who fought better. It was defined by who could afford to keep fighting. American production transformed loss into inconvenience. Japanese losses became permanent. At that point, the Pacific War entered its final phase, not because Japan had been defeated in battle, but because it had been outpaced beyond recovery. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan attempted to force the decisive battle it believed would end the war. The target was Midway Island. The objective was simple: draw out the remaining American aircraft carriers and destroy them in a single engagement. If successful, Japan would regain strategic initiative and extend the window it desperately needed. What Japan did not know was that the Americans were waiting. U.S. cryptanalysts had broken Japanese naval codes and identified Midway as the target. American carriers were positioned in advance, their movements hidden while Japanese forces approached with confidence. When the battle began on June 4, 1942, Japan held numerical superiority. What it lacked was margin for error. In a matter of minutes, American dive bombers struck 3 Japanese fleet carriers while their decks were crowded with fueled and armed aircraft. Fires spread uncontrollably. Explosions followed. By the end of the day, 4 Japanese carriers were lost. The Americans lost 1. The material loss was severe, but it was not decisive by itself. Carriers can be rebuilt. What could not be replaced was experience. Japan lost hundreds of its most seasoned pilots, air crew, and deck personnel, men trained through years of peacetime investment and combat refinement. The Imperial Navy had no reserve of veteran aviators. Its training system had been optimized for quality, not scale. When that quality was destroyed, there was no mechanism to regenerate it quickly. American training pipelines, by contrast, expanded continuously. As Japanese experience collapsed, American competence increased. Midway marked the moment when Japan's offensive capability permanently degraded. From that point forward, Japanese carriers increasingly sailed with inexperienced pilots flying aircraft that could not match American designs. Every subsequent engagement widened the gap. The battle did not end the war, but it ensured that Japan could no longer win it. After Midway, the Pacific War shifted from competition to attrition. And in wars of attrition, experience is a finite resource. Japan had just spent most of it in a single day. After Midway, Japan's greatest weakness was no longer ships. It was time. Specifically, time to train replacements. Before the war, Japanese naval aviation had been elite by design. Pilots entered combat with hundreds of flight hours, rigorous selection standards, and years of preparation. The system produced excellence, but it produced it slowly. That model worked only as long as losses were limited. Midway shattered that assumption. Hundreds of veteran pilots were gone in a single engagement. Japan attempted to replace them, but the structure simply could not scale. Training facilities were limited. Fuel shortages restricted flight hours. Aircraft availability declined. To meet demand, standards were lowered. Training hours were cut. Experience was replaced with urgency. By 1943, the average Japanese naval pilot entered combat with a fraction of the training his predecessors had received. By 1944, some pilots had barely enough hours to safely take off and land. These men were not cowards. They were victims of a system collapsing faster than it could adapt. The American system moved in the opposite direction. Training pipelines expanded alongside production. New pilots entered service with increasing flight hours every year. Aircraft were designed to be forgiving, durable, and survivable. Pilots were rotated home to train the next generation, compounding experience rather than bleeding it away. The result was asymmetrical competence. Each engagement degraded Japan's force while improving America's. This imbalance became catastrophically visible in 1944. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese carrier aviation attempted one final offensive. The result was annihilation. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft were destroyed in days. American losses were minimal. The event became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, not as propaganda, but as description. From that moment forward, Japan's carriers were effectively hollow. They existed, but they could no longer project power. Aircraft were scarce. Pilots were inexperienced. Fuel was rationed. Training was insufficient. Japan had ships without crews, aircraft without pilots, and pilots without experience. The war was no longer about tactics or bravery. It was about replacement velocity. And Japan's pipeline had collapsed beyond repair. Once a modern military loses the ability to train replacements faster than it loses veterans, defeat becomes inevitable. Not dramatic, but certain. By late 1944, Japan was no longer fighting a peer competitor. It was fighting gravity. Every strategic variable was moving in the wrong direction, and none could be reversed. Japan's position worsened not because of a single defeat, but because the war had expanded beyond its capacity to manage it. The Pacific conflict could not be separated from the global war. Germany's decision to declare war on the United States ensured that American industry would operate at full output indefinitely. Yet, even under a Germany-first strategy, the United States produced enough ships, aircraft, and trained personnel to overwhelm Japan simultaneously. Japan faced the United States alone, and even then, it faced only a portion of American power. Logistics compounded the problem. Japan's empire stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. Every operation required fuel, shipping, escorts, and maintenance. American submarines and aircraft steadily eroded these lifelines. Merchant vessels vanished faster than they could be replaced. Oil reached refineries sporadically, if at all. Warships sat idle for lack of fuel, not because they were damaged, but because they could not move. Strategic isolation followed. Bases in the Central Pacific were bypassed and left to wither. Garrison troops remained armed but irrelevant, cut off from resupply and reinforcement. These islands did not need to be conquered. They only needed to be ignored. The Japanese Navy still existed on paper, but it no longer functioned as an integrated force. Coordination broke down. Training declined further. Morale eroded quietly. Ships were preserved not for battle, but for symbolism. At the same time, American forces advanced methodically, supported by logistics that functioned almost without friction. New airfields appeared weeks after landings. Carrier groups rotated continuously. Losses were absorbed without strategic consequence. Japan's leadership continued to speak of decisive battles, but decisive battles require freedom of movement, supply, and replacement. Japan had none. By the end of 1944, the outcome of the Pacific War was no longer dependent on future events. It was determined by accumulated constraints. Japan was isolated, economically exhausted, and strategically immobile. The war continued, but its result did not. By 1945, the Pacific War existed only in form. Japan still had territory, uniforms, and weapons. What it no longer had was function. The systems that sustain modern war, fuel flow, shipping capacity, trained manpower, and industrial replacement, had already collapsed. Japan's leadership had understood the numbers from the beginning. Admiral Yamamoto's warning about 6 months was not pessimism, it was precision. He knew that once the war extended beyond Japan's initial offensive window, industrial reality would assert itself. Pearl Harbor was an attempt to rewrite that reality through shock. It failed. From that moment forward, Japan was fighting a war of hope against a war of math. Hope that America would tire. Hope that decisive battles would change momentum. Hope that sacrifice could substitute for replacement. None of it mattered. Wars of attrition do not reward belief. They reward throughput. The United States could replace ships faster than Japan could sink them. It could train pilots faster than Japan could lose them. It could absorb defeat without collapse because its economy was insulated, diversified, and geographically secure. Japan's economy was none of those things. Every loss was permanent. Every delay compounded failure. By the final months of the war, Japanese warships sat idle for lack of fuel. Aircraft existed without pilots. Factories stood silent, not from bombing alone, but from material starvation. The empire was hollow, intact in appearance, dead in function. The atomic bombs did not end Japan's ability to fight. They ended Japan's ability to deny what had already happened. The logistical defeat of the empire preceded its political surrender by months. Pearl Harbor did not doom Japan because it angered America. It doomed Japan because it activated a system Japan could not compete with. Once that system began converting raw materials into ships, aircraft, and trained crews at scale, the outcome became irreversible. This is the lesson of the Pacific War. Victory does not belong to the side that fights hardest or strikes first. It belongs to the side that can replace loss without breaking. Japan chose war knowing the math. America fought knowing the math favored them, and math does not bend.